No leaders seemed to concede much last night, despite the Conservatives' failure to capitalize on an embattled Liberal Party, the Liberals' reduction to a minority government, and the NDP and Greens' inability to turn popular support into seats. Are the brave faces on less than stellar results the right approach to this outcome? And how does the Liberal minority mend the provincial and regional divides we've been talking about all evening? These are all good questions for the Premier's League. Over in Vancouver, Ujjal Dosanjh, Premier of BC from 2000 to 2001 and former federal Liberal cabinet minister. Alison Redford, Premier of Alberta from 2011 to 2014, joins us from Calgary. Brian Gallant led New Brunswick from 2014 to 2018. He's now special advisor to the president of Ryerson on innovation, cybersecurity and law. With me here in Toronto, next to Bob Rae, Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 95, former interim leader of the federal Liberal Party as well, and host of the podcast Political Stripes. Hi, everybody. Wonderful to see you on this day after the 43rd general election. Mr. Rae, I'm going to start with you because we just heard a number of speeches from all the leaders following the results of the election last night. I had the privilege of sitting next to you while we watched those go on and on and on.
It was a long night.
I was privy to some of the comments you made, so I won't say them for you, but I'm wondering if you could tell us what you thought overall of the tone that the leaders ended up striking.
I thought they missed an opportunity, generally speaking. I mean, I think there was some effort. Mr. Trudeau talked directly to people in Saskatchewan and Alberta who had not particularly voted for the Liberal Party and where cabinet ministers have been defeated and so on. But I felt that on the whole, people missed an opportunity to try to talk about how we're going to heal some of these rifts that are now in the country. They're not new. They've been around for a long, long time, many of them, and it's going to take a lot of hard work to overcome them and to deal with them. But they are very real, and I think the thing that it was too bad about the election was that it was so negative and so narrowly casted. There was just very little effort to kind of take us up and beyond some of these regional differences and partisan differences and ideological differences, and I think that's going to be the real challenge of the next few years in terms of how we go forward as a country.
Mr. Gallant, can I get you to weigh in on some of those regional differences? We saw the Premier, for example, of New Brunswick today reacting to it. Premiers all over the country, really. What we saw at the end of the day, when you look at that map, is very much so, no representation of the government, essentially, from Winnipeg to Vancouver, an increased presence of the Bloc in Quebec. We had, I think, in our panel last week, a discussion about this exact possibility. How do you think the leaders did in addressing that new reality?
Well, a few things. First off, I thought it was really interesting that there was no real concession speeches last night. Everybody
won.
Well, that's it. And I think what happened was everybody sort of told themselves, well, there's no sort of clear national winner with regards to expectations and the narrative. You could obviously argue the Bloc had a very good night last night. So there were no concession speeches, and everybody was just positioning as to why they won the election. Now, I think Bob's absolutely right, and the question you just asked, Vashi, is important in the sense that nobody really addressed what is pretty evident in terms of the electoral map. I think that the Prime Minister will have to work very hard to demonstrate in action how he's going to continue to make sure that all parts of the country will be represented. And I said this a few times over the last few days as we were all sort of opining on the possibility of a minority government. In theory, minority governments can be really interesting. You can have more perspectives represented in the decision-making process, in the debate, and in the discourse. But practically, they can maybe do very much the opposite. So I hope that the Trudeau team will find a way to make sure that they're reaching out to all the political parties, all the regions of our country, and of course, all the premiers, which I know the Prime Minister will do. He certainly did it while I was at that table.
Okay, I want to get Ms. Redford in on that. What do you think the outcome in Alberta says about the way in which many people in that province feel right now?
Well, I've been saying for a couple of weeks that I was fairly certain that what we were going to start to see was a breakout of what Canada used to look like 1972, 1979, 1980, and I think we're seeing that in terms of some very stark regionalism. I think that Brian is right that a minority government is an opportunity for government to do things differently, and I am going to be a broken record and say that if you look at the issues that Canadians care about, jobs, pipeline, climate change, and First Nations reconciliation, that there is an opportunity to do things on a completely non-regional and non-partisan basis that allows us to put a model in place to integrate that discussion and address those issues in a way that can satisfy different parts of the country. And it doesn't mean everyone's going to get what they want, but it would allow us to elevate the conversation away from partisan politics and regional politics. Because things like climate change, and I'm going to suggest pipeline and First Nations reconciliation, should no longer be partisan issues in Canada. They are problems we need to find solutions for, and if we can rise above where we were yesterday, which I heard a lot of language from leaders yesterday to suggest that they could, then we might have an opportunity to do something entirely differently that we never would have had an opportunity to do with the majority government. So I'm going to be, as usual, very optimistic and say that if leaders come together and really want to solve these problems and step out of the regional and the partisan politics, we can resolve this. And I actually think the number of young people that voted sent a message that that's what they want us to do. So I hope that that's where the conversation goes.
Mr. Desange, do you think there is an appetite among federal leaders and provincial leaders to put aside partisan politics, put aside regional politics in the name of the type of endeavor that Ms. Redford describes?
Well, from the speeches last night and from the reaction from some of the premiers, it doesn't seem that way, and that's unfortunate. As Bob said, I think there was a missed opportunity last night from several leaders to begin the healing process. They recognize, they know the country better than most of us, that we have vast regional differences, which we are a large country with a lot of differences. And British Columbia perhaps is the only province where all of the major parties are well represented, other than the Bloc, of course. And you know, that's not the case in Alberta or Saskatchewan. And they needed to make that extra effort last night, and it wasn't present, and I was absolutely disappointed. There was no national narrative knitting the country together behind any political party, as it was in 2015 behind the Liberals from coast to coast to coast. And I believe it was a missed opportunity in that regard as well, in terms of creating a narrative for any political party to weave and spin the country together.
Yeah.
I just have a few minutes left, but I want to get one comment in from each of you. Mr. Ray, there is already a reaction from various premiers in the province, and they are different, in the various provinces rather. They are different. We've heard, Premier Moe come out quite critical of the Liberals. Blaine Higgs take it a step back and say in New Brunswick that perhaps, the federal carbon, the voters have spoken around the federal carbon tax, for example. Premier Ford in this province as well, an interesting reaction today. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I think Premier Ford is reaching out. I mean, I think that's wise of him to do that, and I think it's time for that to happen. Premier Moe and I know Premier Kenney's going to be saying something. I just hope everybody leaves open the opportunity for national diplomacy and for a real effort at finding solutions. I agree entirely with what Alison Redford just said. I think there is an opportunity here, but you've got to put all the things on the table very clearly. You've got to talk about, and not just talk about, but deal with the Indigenous issues. The pipeline is a serious problem for Canada. It's not just an Alberta problem or a Saskatchewan problem. It's a Canadian problem, because if we can't get goods to market, that's a problem for everyone. It's a problem for the whole country. It's an Ontario problem. We need to look as well at issues that are being raised by other premiers in terms of equalization and other things. We should say, look, there are no taboo topics here. That's right. But when we raise these questions, we need to be able to say, how are we going to solve them? And if one premier says, well, I have to have this, this, and this, or else, that's not going to help us. We need to figure out a way to say, look, we're listening to each other's anxieties, but let's try and find a solution. And I think this is the moment when we can do it. And I know the Prime Minister wants to do that. I know that's instinctively what he wants to do. It's not easy to do. I think, we've got to look at how it can be done. And we should be creative about the mechanisms we use to do it.
Quick comment,
Absolutely.
Mr. Blant?
Well, I think Premier Moe, who's a great person, by the way, I had the chance to sit with him at the Premier's table for a little while, and I really do like him, and I think he's working hard for the people of his province. But with that said, I do think he errs a little bit when he tries to make the argument that the results last night in Saskatchewan mean that the what he calls carbon tax, the price on carbon pollution, has to be cancelled. If anything, I think the mood of the electorate during the campaign would very much say the opposite. I think that it was clear that many people want us to actually step up even more, and some were maybe dissatisfaction with the Trudeau Liberals because they felt that climate change wasn't being addressed enough. And I think that's why you saw at times in the polling and in the momentum, people going to the NDP and the Greens and considering to vote for some of the so-called third parties. So I really think the mood of the electorate on that very important issue, the largest challenge facing this generation, was really the opposite. I think people want us to step up more when it comes to fighting climate change. So I think on that, of his three asks, that one was I think, a bit of an error, and he didn't really read the election results the right way across the country.
Ms. Redford?
Well, I really support what's been said so far in that the issues that we're talking about as Canadians are all connected to climate change. So whether we're talking about a price on carbon, the reaction of New Brunswick, the reaction of Saskatchewan, what will be the reaction of Alberta, it really is about trying to come together in a different way to solve these problems.
Mr. Desange, last word to you.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said by all of them, except that with respect to Saskatchewan and Alberta, the fact is that they have rejected carbon tax in terms of the kind of votes they cast for the Conservatives. And if Quebec had ever done that, you would never tell Quebec you're wrong. And that creates a sense of alienation. So you have to figure out how we deal with that sense of resentment that one part of the country always gets their issues soft-pedaled, and the other parts of the country get told off that you're wrong somehow if you feel in a particular way. And that is deep-seated in Alberta and Saskatchewan. It isn't going to go away by simply saying the country has voted for climate change in favor of dealing with it, and carbon tax is the only solution. And I think that we have to find a solution that's acceptable to Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much to all four of you. Really appreciate your time. Thanks to our Premiers League, Ujjal Desange, Alison Redford, Brian Gallant, and Bob Ray. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.